is the chair of the ICES Advisory Committee, and maybe, Mark, you want to say something more about yourself when you start, but it's been clear from the other sessions we've had, and we've had a data collection on Monday and stock assessment yesterday, moving to management advice today, that ICES is really a driver in this field, and many of us have close links to ICES. I think also we've discussed that some of the things that are going on in ICES would have transfer and value also to other parts of the world. So we do have world-class activities in this very complicated field of ocean best practices in fisheries. I don't want to repeat what has been said in the intro session and earlier sessions, but it is clear that it's a field that is so big, so interesting for everybody around the world. Every fishery in the world has, and there are many of them which have long history and long cultural traditions, importance to people, importance to ocean activities more than perhaps any other field, involving more people. So the things that have been sort of on the margins of this ocean best practices workshop as a whole is to look at how these things can go together and produce something that can be shared, that can be discussed, and can be forwarded, and can lead to improve quality in what we all do. Best practices is not about imposing standards that everybody has to follow, but it's about developing the activities towards a better direction. So we want to talk about community needs. We want to talk about how this ocean best practices system, which is much wider than fisheries, how that can help this community, how that can be taken forward within the UN decade, and how we can establish future collaboration. So with that, I think I give the floor to Mark. We want to discuss evidence, we want to discuss decision, we want to discuss compliance, and I think this is really showing also the links to the discussions we've had in data collection and in stock assessment, that it's really important to have these links and recognize these links, and don't do this in silos. And of course, that applies to management advice. So, Mark, are you ready to take over? I'll give the floor to you.
Yes, thank you, Peter. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. So, is the screen visible to you all?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I'm Mark Dickey-Collis. I'm the chair of the ICES Advisory Committee. ICES is an interesting organization globally in that we're a science network that provides advice both on fisheries and management of human activities in the Northeast Atlantic and adjacent seas. But we're not an RFMO, a regional fisheries management organization. We are a science network. But we do, however, give advice on fisheries to the European Union, also to Norway and Iceland, and to an RFMO, NEAF, and to NASCO, the Salmon Fishery Conservation Organization. So my talk is about providing advice to manage fisheries. Where do we stand? Now, we're very lucky in our area in that there's been a lot of thought about what we mean by best practice for providing fisheries management advice. And there are some very substantial pieces of legislation or guidance documents that are out there. Oh, I'm just going to stop for a minute, and I've opened the wrong presentation. Sorry, this doesn't help the recording, does it?
We can manage this, no problem. And we
Okay, here we go. All right, let's try again. That's the right presentation with the acronyms explained. So here we have many established players such as FAO Fisheries and the Convention on Biological Diversity, who have set out a number of guidances and best practices for providing fisheries advice. The first overriding rule is that everything should be based on best scientific evidence or best scientific information. There's a whole range of different agreements, including some European ones, which say evidence, information, data, those kinds of things. Best available science is something ICES uses. And these are all documented, and one obvious place is the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. Now, the Convention on Biological Diversity, in its ecosystem-based management, EBM principles, it says that the management objectives for which we must manage a fishery must be societally derived. They must be agreed by society. And in the case of fisheries, some very common ones are MSY, maximum sustainable yield, precaution, and ecosystem approach. The FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries says that the data is a duty on all to compile the data and disseminate the data throughout the organizations and the people affected by the fisheries. And then we have the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries again, saying that there should be transparent decision-making processes. Now, there's a large number of countries that have signed up to the Aarhus Convention, which is by the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. And many of these countries are in Asia as well as in Europe. And here it states that there should be public access to the data, and there should also be public participation in decision-making. And almost all European and many Central Asian countries have signed up to this agreement. So here we have a setup with best scientific evidence, societally managed objectives, compile and disseminate the data, transparent decision-making, and public access and participation in decision-making. Now, in fisheries, I work particularly in the industrial and large-scale fisheries, providing advice to those. But we have at least three, and these are interlinked, and there are other sets of types of fisheries: industrial, large scale, artisanal, small scale, and recreational leisure. Now, they're driven by different objectives and different purposes. Industrial, large scale is often to make companies profit. Artisanal, small scale is often for individuals to make profit and to provide food. And recreational and leisure is often for pleasure, for cultural reasons. So all of these impact how we provide fisheries advice. So they impact it in terms of scale, in terms of the activities, and in terms of the objectives. So all of the 5 that I mentioned on the slide before are around this circle here. Best evidence, agreed objectives, transparent decision-making, compiled data, and access and participation. And all of them, we have to find mechanisms to make them relevant to industrial, artisanal, and recreation. And in all 3 of those cases, and other cases as well, the advice context, the knowledge base, and the expectations will vary. However, I gave you 5 big ones. There are also some slightly, I view them as slightly lesser in terms of where we are now, but in addition, the FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries also says that the best way to manage is through long-term management plans, that wherever possible, traditional knowledge should be used, that there should be preparation and methods available to rebuild or restore or recover biomass. This is also listed in the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. And that's if the biomass is too low. And that economic and social factors should be explicit within the advice and the decision-making process as well. So here we have the circle on the right side for perhaps best practice in fisheries advice, and we have 4 additional elements that need to be considered: the management plans, traditional knowledge, environmental, social and economic, and restore biomass. So when we talk about best practices for giving advice, these are the elements that already organizations like FAO and Convention on Biological Diversity are expecting us to follow. So we provide fisheries advice in the ICES context to other organizations, and in many contexts it's given directly by scientists who work for regional fisheries management organizations, or given to councils who manage fisheries, such as in the USA, or in different national, community, regional approaches. And in all of our cases, there are some very important characteristics that are required for the advice givers. The best practice must ensure and maintain that our role is legitimate and trusted, that our methods are credible, and our advice is relevant. And our job as advisors not only must cover the best practice elements that I mentioned before, but they must ensure that society views us, and the managers and the stakeholders view us, as legitimate and trusted, that we use credible methods, and that our advice is relevant. Now, I'm going to give you an example of what we are just beginning to do in ICES. And ICES, as I said, is a science advisor on fisheries and the marine ecosystem and human activities in the ecosystem in the Northeast Atlantic. And our advisory committee has just, in fact, a few weeks ago, come up with 10 principles for advice. I'm going to go through these 10 principles and explain why we have them. The first one is that we need a dialogue with managers about their challenges and expectations for advice. The idea that managers have a problem, they understand their question, and they ask an organization or their advisors the question without a dialogue is an anathema. They do need to talk to the advisors, and the advisors need to understand their concept as well. What we need to do is to clarify the management objectives and accept all risk at the start and often through the process. And by this, I already mentioned that we're expected to have society choosing the management objectives by which we give the advice. And those can often be a bit more opaque or vague or ambiguous. And so it's useful to clarify and to work to achieve an understanding about those management objectives. It might be a bit naive to say clarify, because often the management objectives aren't that clear, but throughout the process that will help and become clearer. The next one is accessible documentation of the framework and procedures, and I'm sure many of you have already touched on this with the Oceans Best Practice works and sessions that have gone on, and I'm not going to dwell too much on that, but it's important that everything is documented and very accessible. That the advice is timely delivered, and also that the underlying information is available timely in relation to the giving of that advice. That the underlying data are findable, attributable, interoperable, and reusable. Many of you will recognize these are the FAIR principles for data, and ICES has signed up to this where it can. I mean, there are some limitations due to confidentiality and ownership of the data, but overall we aspire to enact the FAIR principles on data. I've already mentioned that we use best available science, and by that we mean the most up-to-date. What we try not to do as fisheries management advisors is say more research is required and we can't answer. We try to give a pragmatic and operational solution to a challenge with the best available science. And saying come back in 4 years after you've given me €500,000 is really not appropriate. So we use the available science that is at the time. A crucial feature is peer review of the methods and the approaches. And this ensures that our advice remains credible, but it also ensures that we are using best available science. We need to make sure that the advice is relevant, comprehensive, unambiguous, and consistent with the knowledge base. That goes without saying, but often, particularly with a science network, you have a lot of scientists who want to highlight their particular favorite bit of science, or their bit of science that needs a little bit more investment. So it's important that we remain relevant, and it's important that the knowledge is consistent and strong enough to provide the advice. And the second to last one is that we, as an organization, agree the advice by consensus. And crucially, and this is one of the strengths of ICES in particular, it's independent of the managers. And that's quite important in terms of the credibility and legitimacy of the advice. And then one final part, which ICES is very clear on, and this is about maintaining trust and independence. As it is impartial advice, we have no incentive to lobby for implementation of our advice. Fisheries advisors, fisheries management advisors, in my mind, shouldn't run around and complain when the advice is not used, or if it is perceived that it has been slightly adapted. It is society's right to be able to do that. So these 10 principles are what we use in ICES to provide the best available scientific advice to international and national authorities for the resource management, conservation and sustainability goals in the North Atlantic. We do this for over 260 fish stocks. We give bycatch advice, DC impact advice, marine protected areas, and additional requests that include shipping, biodiversity, spatial management, fisheries management plans, fishing gear, and renewable energy. And these principles are what we hope will guide us as we enter into a more ecosystem-based management arena, where things are not quite as straightforward as this is our fish stock, here is our assessment, and here are the management plans. We now have a situation where we have the majority of the fisheries we provide advice for are mixed fisheries, and we also have issues such as seabed impact and bycatch and biodiversity issues coming in linked to those fisheries. So what are the gaps? The gaps are actually quite wide scale. I already mentioned the industrial, artisanal and recreational. What I just showed you for ICES is very much along the lines of the industrial large scale. And we're lucky enough and are pushing ahead that we can address best evidence, compiled data, agreed objective, transparent decision making, although some will argue perhaps that in the EU that's less so. Access and participation, there's access and participation in the process is improving. We're still a bit weak on restore biomass. The interpretation of the Code of Conduct and the UN Fish Stocks Agreement can be a bit vague, and each region I know in the world has a different way of approaching restoring biomass. Many areas are still working on how to include traditional knowledge in these fisheries managements, because fisheries management advice has a tradition of being incredibly quantitative. So how do you work with individuals who have important information to bring into the management setup? And then we have management plans. We have a lot of those, and many parts of the industrial fisheries across the world have management plans. And then we have environmental, social and economic. And in this context, very few regions of the world for the industrial fisheries are explicitly bringing in the social and economic. With artisanal, there's a lot less and a lot more, a very different context, because quite a lot of them are community-based or region-based. And here, evidence has different approaches. The concept of compiled data is different. Access and participation might in fact be better in artisanal and community-based small-scale fisheries. Agreed objectives may well be different. Transparent decision-making will be in a different context too. Management plans will follow probably not the kind of the step change approach in the industrial large-scale fisheries, because the metrics are likely to be different, but there often are management plans. And then we turn to recreational, and there are plenty of gaps here across the board in almost all of these elements. Some countries, such as the USA and Australia, have spent a lot of time building systems of best practice for recreational, and others are just beginning. Europe is very poor on recreational fisheries at the moment. There's a number for which we do give advice, cod and sea bass, but there are plenty where we don't have the information. A classic being salmon, both in the Baltic and also in the west of Europe. Another one is pollock, and we really need to invest more in what do we mean by best practice for recreational fisheries. And I think that is the end of my talk. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. This is really quite a comprehensive field you're covering, and showing the breadth of the already existing frameworks that you're working within, and also in the scope of the work as it develops, and how also fisheries advice, I suspect, or I may suggest, may form an evidence base or an experience base that can be quite valuable in other fields. And you addressed also the fact that ICES is working to provide advice to OSPAR on other issues than fisheries itself, and that this model is actually perhaps, I think, worth to be discussed for other areas of the world, and then for even more activities in the ocean as they emerge. Perhaps not to be as big as fisheries, but still to be more significant than they have been. So we can get to that, but with a relatively limited crowd, I think we should have the possibility still for a good discussion, and I can open the floor for anybody wanting to take the floor. I think we don't need to organize this discussion very strongly with this limited crowd, so please feel free to just take the floor and jump in.
Mark, thank you very much. That was a really good talk. I think you pretty much wrote the best practice right there. So maybe we can just put this recording up on OBPS and then we're sorted out. There was one thing I was wondering about in terms of, you're also increasingly hearing about transparent policymaking, which tries to address, you know, impact assessments and having transparency and linked to evidence. I'm curious where you see, because you talked about social and economic within the scientific advice and the management plans. Do you see that simply as an extension of the transparent policy making, or do you see it as a separate branch where there's the sort of hard scientific evidence based on existing data, and then you have the economic and policy fitting into the policy making as a separate strand? Or do you think that they need to be closer entwined than that to make sense? Hopefully that question makes sense to begin with.
Makes sense to me. I could talk for hours on this one, but I'm not going to. Well, the first thing to say is that the social and economic side is already written into many management agreements. If I take the common fisheries policy, the beginning, the preamble has a lot of commitments in terms of communities, in terms of economics, in terms of markets. However, the decision-making process around fish quotas, etc., if we take it as simple as fish quotas, has a very clear conservation objective. And so all the decision-making is explicit in that, with regards to that one objective. but the decision making on social and economic is implicit in that you have this trade-off that goes in the council. And a lot of the campaigns against overfishing are, why aren't you using the scientists' advice? Well, the reason they're not using the scientists' advice is because the objectives of the CFP actually aren't addressed through the science advice. And there's one terrible thing that has developed in almost everywhere in the world. Those conservation objectives become the number. And therefore, the concept that objectives need to be traded off or discussed, and it's the role of society, not the scientists, to talk about the trade-offs, mean that the number is dominating, but those other objectives are being ignored because there is no evidence base. Now, a lot of politicians don't want the evidence base there because they are playing to the politics of getting their next vote, etc., etc., and they want to appear to be champions, and they don't really want the evidence to be there. So it's a kind of a tricky one there. But I don't think we should. I think we should move away from the concept that scientists provide fisheries advice in terms of you must do this, into the consequences of doing this is this. So it's options that we offer the decision makers. And one final thing, in terms of risk, we have a lot of differences around the world about how people interpret risk. But by having the social and economic implicit, it means often that the managers and the decision makers actually don't really agree with the risk they've told the scientists to build into the conservation objectives. Because they think they've got wiggle room. And we've got a lot of these management plans with agreed risk, and yet they are saying, well, we won't go completely with this this management plan for conservation objectives, because actually our risk threshold is in fact much lower than we were officially saying.
Thank you. That is a very comprehensive answer for what I was wondering, and like you say, something you could discuss for hours in itself. Thank you very much.
Hello, good morning. I also have a question. My name is Nicole Kastner. I'm a project manager of a big EU project called EuroSea. It's about improving and integrating the European observing and forecasting system. And part of our work is also on fisheries and improving the implementation of the existing networks, but also improving the monitoring and giving better data on ocean observation towards the fishery industry. I'm not a fishery biologist, also I have some background there. I've been on some cruises in that field in the Baltic, and I'm wondering a little bit about the time factor here. So Mark, maybe you could talk a little bit about how much time actually passes from getting data from maybe the different countries or monitoring cruises until there's a decision or an advice made by the ISIS.
Ooh. Well, to start with, if we're only talking about the conservation objectives, fishing mortality and the biomass decisions based on management rules or other approaches, you need a time series of data. Almost all of our methods and techniques, and you've already had Manuela and Rick talk about stock assessment, all of those require time series. And a stock assessment really is unstable until you have at least 5 or 6 years, okay, of data to begin to get some degree. It's still very poor, but you get some degree of stability. So the time frame is you can't just begin there and then to give advice using the methods we use now. There are other methods, and I'm talking about the big industrial fisheries advice rather than the local community advice. But in terms of the specific, once you've got a time series up and running, it can vary, but generally we give advice within 18 to 3 months of a survey. Some surveys are coming in, some sampling comes in just 3 months before, and that really isn't great in terms of best practice, because the quality assurance is a little more tricky, and quality control. But others, it can be, it's usually within the 12 months before. So all time series are updated. So let's say 12 months to 3 months before tends to be the time that occurs before it is added to our data flows. I think Jens knows more about this than me, actually, with his experience in Aberdeen.
I think you covered that pretty accurately, but I think you actually touched on something during your best practice as well, is that when you give advice, you have to base on what is there. So obviously in the ideal scenario, we have up-to-date and timely and relevant and high quality check data and stuff like that. But the situation is that the advice for management plans needs to be given irrespective, pretty much. So, you know, for example, I know that ICES has already been talking about this year, impacted by COVID. Advice still has to be generated in the absence of some data.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll throw in one myself. You mentioned several of the frameworks, including code of conduct and so on, and some of these, or the totality, is maybe partly almost like an ethics code for researchers or for the people who actually do this. It's kind of an individual requirement that you have to act in a certain way. And it seems to me that that much of this has developed, and as you described for fisheries, is also quite relevant and would be applicable to the wider fields of management advice in the ocean in general. I don't know if you have any comment to that, and then maybe I'll throw in another question, which is even which is maybe going beyond the scope of what we asked you to talk about, or what this is about. We have fisheries management advice, and then you mentioned that there are, when for conservation or for other objectives, there are I believe there are sometimes different goals of management and management plans and so on in the wider marine field, where you have different goals and objectives which are incompatible to some extent. They are policy goals of keeping biodiversity, policy goals of keeping fish catch, policy goals of building out renewable energy and so on, and some of them are more or less incompatible, and that's what people try to do with management plans and integrated ocean management. But in this kind of universe that we are moving with, more and more interacting ocean economy sectors more and more strongly in the future, I wonder if you have any thoughts about not management advice, but sort of providing scientific basis for policy development, which is a totally different thing than management advice. I realize that, and I'm fully aware of it. But there are processes that I'm also some involved in that try to do this. To what extent do you think that we can sort of build upon and transfer the experience from ICES, fisheries and other topics into this different, quite different domain? Sorry to maybe pose a very broad question, but I thought I'd take the benefit of having you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Actually, both your questions are really closely linked, I think. Because we developed these 10 principles just now because we had we had what we called the Introduction to Advice, and it was completely dominated by fisheries. And so it was, what do you do at this biomass level with your fishing mortality? How should you advise this? What are the ranges? What are the break points? And we felt that as you said, we're giving advice to OSPAR, to the DG Environment, the Environment Director General in Brussels. So we're also obliged to give advice into ecosystem-based management. And we came up with these 10 principles to keep us robust, not just for fisheries advice, but also for the EBM as a whole. So not just ecosystem-based management advice, but the interconnection between ecosystem-based fisheries management advice too. And we feel that these 10 principles are giving us a backbone to protect our legitimacy and our credibility in the world as an advisor to governments and intergovernmental organizations. Now, the objective question is exactly why we created these 10 principles, because we have increasingly found that we have a little rule, that internal rule, it's not one of our principles, that our advice should be consistent with across everything. And we sometimes fail at that, but our job is to try and work very hard to ensure that the advice that we give is consistent across all the areas. So when we get conflicting or incompatible objectives, it gets a little tricky. But we've said it's not our job to point out the incompatibility, but I'm going to read you some text. Where these objectives and descriptions of risk are unclear, ICES will identify these in the advice and, where possible, provide options for management action and the consequences of those options and their trade-offs. So it's society's role to think, and it touches a bit on the social, economic and conservation objectives that we had in the fisheries only side. But our job is not to say this is more important than that in terms of the objectives, but our job is to say this is the consequence of prioritizing this objective over this objective, and feed that into the advice. I'm going to give you a fisheries example, and it's a quite well-known one. It's in the Baltic. You could manage the fisheries in the Baltic to maximize pelagic fisheries, the herring and the sprat. But that would be at the detriment of the demersal fisheries, which are the cod and the flatfish. So you could maximize for cod and flatfish, and in fact, that would be at the detriment of the herring and sprat fisheries. Ironically, of course, right now the Baltic is in such a state that the demersals, particularly the cod, can't be managed anyway because they're not doing very well. But yeah, that's a clear trade-off, and it's certainly not a fisheries advisor's job, and it comes back to these objectives, the societal objectives. It's the job of society to say, well, actually, we want to manage this. Another one, I'm going to use fisheries again, is in Sweden, they have this objective of making nature available to the people, and that includes having fisheries that make people's weekend walks feel nice and warm and cozy. So you've got to have active fisheries, landing fish to make people, and fishing boats in harbours to make people enjoy their culture. That's not the same as having a fisheries objective for employment or profit or food security. So does that help, Peter?
Yes, indeed, and very illuminating also with the examples. I mean, showing these different ways of handling conflicting goals and activities, and we've talked for years about ecosystem services. People talk about nature values and different ways of bringing different parts of the what I could call an extended ocean economy sectors, including then the ecosystem contributions to that, not only those which are already monetized. And all of that discussion is typically what you see in the policy space. And then I believe it's very important that the interaction with science and the science management advice, or basically I think what you're saying is also to explore consequences of activities that society may want to do, is very important that is done in the right way and not in the wrong way, because otherwise you can have different groups of scientists being called for different players in the political field, and then the disagreements, if you wish, or the different perspectives play out in the wrong arena. So that's why I think it's very, very interesting that ICES is not only working in fisheries, and it's different from the way in which, the way ICES works with governments and with RFMO is different than the way in which many RFMOs around the world are working, because they don't have an ICES-like body around. And I really think this field is quite interesting to see how it will develop and what we can learn from ICES. We have everything from biodiversity in international waters, how to deal with those aspects, and ongoing BB&J negotiations. But I'm sorry, I'm sort of taking maybe the group off on a tangent and moving into the future.
But I was going to ask you, actually, because I think we're lucky to have you here because of the Norwegian management plans. And how has Norway managed to ensure best practice in building its Norwegian management plans for the Barents Sea and the Norwegian Sea with the fisheries context in there? Because I know they were kind of excluded from the management plans, but also included in terms of concepts. And I just don't, I struggle. You're talking about the broader ecosystem-based management and integrated management, which are very similar concepts. But how, in terms of best practice, is the evidence provided into that in the Norwegian example?
Yeah, we have these regional management plans, one for each of the major basins, the North Sea, the Barents Sea, and the Norwegian Sea. And there has been a schedule of upgrading these every 4 years or so. We are now changing that so that they will actually all be updated more or less in a parallel process. And there is this with a Norwegian name, I guess, Faglig Forum, that would be sort of expertise group or something. And in parallel with that, there is the observations group. And the first one is led by a directorate, and the second is led by Institute of Marine Research, of the science. And there is a very interesting, I think, but I don't want to spend everybody's time on this in detail, but a very interesting development of division of labor between those two parts of that process. We had a recent case, just spending 1 minute on that, the activities in the Barents Sea in connection with the ice edge. The ice edge is moving back with climate change. And this is a very important area for the ecosystem, very productive area and so on. And there's a question of oil and gas activity moving into this area, and we have fisheries and so on going on. And then there you have policy objectives of staying away from the most fragile areas. And there are many different concepts here being used for the most vulnerable areas and so on. And then it's a question of definition of where is the ice edge. Who has the competence to decide where goes the ice edge, because that will have major implications on the activities which will be allowed. And to be honest with you, I don't think I'm very proud of the way in which this was dealt with in Norway in this particular case. There are some of the definition areas which are strictly scientific, which should have been dealt with in another way and in another forum. And there's also a provision in the legislation which allows new oil and gas fields being developed, you know, one by one, just adding to an old plan without revisiting the integrated effects of these big scale developments. So I would certainly say that while I sometimes hear, at least in Norway, that we are the world champions of integrated management plans, Norway tends to think that we are the world champions in many areas, this one included. I do think we have a lot of issues to deal with when it comes to separating, as exactly what you were talking about, what are the questions asked to the science and the expertise, and what are the questions that we should just explore consequences of various action, bring it back to the policy realm. I don't think we are very good at that, and we need to really work hard on developing that further. I don't know if that was a good answer.
I think so.
I have a bit of an open question in the context of this management advice, because obviously we've kind of covered how there's a whole set of principles that are really good about how you can establish it and how you have to provide a degree of advice almost no matter what the situation is. And yesterday during the stock assessment, there was a presentation about how you can assess a stock no matter whether it's data rich or data poor. Yes, there needs to be some information, but there are different tools. Throughout all of this, then there's a challenge of how you communicate uncertainty. And I wonder if any of you could reflect on that aspect, because it's obviously a competing pressure between some kind of advice has to be given, and presumably part of it has to give a context about uncertainty, but without basically just undermining the entire process to the point where you lose trust in the advice process as well, or the best practice that's been applied.
I'm trying not to answer everything. I think other people need to talk. Shall I go? Yeah. Uncertainty is very dangerous when you're giving advice, because some people see it as a reason to have drastic action, and some people see it as a reason to have no action. I'm going to draw an extreme example. If you say something is uncertain, a lot of the environmental campaigners will say you can't do anything because of the precautionary principle. If you say that your advice is uncertain, a lot of fishers will often say, well, we don't need to act anything because actually you don't know what you're talking about. So it can be used in different ways by different people. So that's the first thing to notice. The second thing is there is a difference between uncertainty and confidence. And we at the advisory committee just last week had a bit of a discussion about uncertainty. By that we meant model uncertainty, that kind of stuff. And confidence in our advice is something a bit different. And IPBES has recently done some work on uncertainty, confidence. And I know that IPCC has done some work on confidence as well. The other thing is, what do you mean by uncertainty? Do you mean the model uncertainty or evidence-based uncertainty, or uncertainty in the advice? Because we in ICES have hierarchy is the wrong word. We have a set of systems to provide advice in data-limited situations. Now, we've evaluated those methods and done lots of simulations, and we are confident that our advice is still robust. We have confidence in that advice, even knowing that the data and the knowledge base is weaker, because we've built in precautionary buffers and things like that. So while the evidence is more uncertain, our advice is just as certain, and we are just as confident that it is appropriate because of the mechanisms we're using to account for the differences in uncertainty in the evidence base. Does that help? It's a bit.
Yes, no, I actually think, like, in the context of this best practice, that whole uncertainty and confidence thing is really important, to take account of that. Those are two different things, that if people are designing best practices, it's really important to have that, because I know there's a specific working group on uncertainty quantification during this OBPS session. I think they're more dealing with the oceanography side of things, but we don't have anything about confidence in the same context. And I think that it probably does fit better in with this context of developing management advice, but and best practices around that, I guess, will more or less come from this working group, from the fisheries side of things, which is probably where most of the formalized and established management advice has at least started, just because of the presence of larger economic interests in many ways.
I have a question for Mark. Mark, Nikos Nikoudakis. I'm working at IMR. I'm involved in the EAF Nansen program in Africa and the Indian Ocean. And my question is, what would you say that is the driving force behind ICES? Is it the skilled scientists? Is it a strong secretariat? Is it the funds that ICES gets from the member states that enable all these processes to take place? Is it the fact that the advice provided by ICES is taken seriously into account by the ones that are asking for this advice? And the real question is, what would you think that the best practice would be for implementing such a process for other areas in the world, like developing countries, Asia, Africa? How should we aim to structure a system that could be not identical, of course, to ICES, but working in the same ways?
Well, to start with your first question, what's the driving force of ICES? The answer is yes to all of those. We are fortunate to live in a well-resourced system, and we will all complain that we don't have enough resources, we don't have enough expertise, we don't have enough good systems in place, but it would be naive of people in the North Atlantic, and I'm including US and Canada. Although ICES doesn't give advice to those areas, the US and Canada play a role in the advisory system. They're very active in the advisory committee. It would be naive of us to say that we are not a extremely well-resourced, technologically forward-looking system. That's also a weakness, in that we love highly organized solutions, we love technological solutions. And people often say to me, well, ecosystem-based management, ecosystem-based fisheries management requires a very strong, huge knowledge base. And actually, I point to the examples around the world, Africa, Asia, South America, where there are much less resources, and yet you have quite effective ecosystem-based fisheries management. There are champions for ecosystem-based management in UNEP and in FAO that really are much better examples of EBM and EBFM than we have in Europe. I mean, look at us in Europe. We've one of the most studied seas in the world, the Baltic. And I keep using it as an example, but I think it's an extreme example, a very useful example. Huge. Look at the numbers of papers every year written on the Baltic. Look at BONUS, a vast research organization. Look at HELCOM, one of the best regional seas conventions in the world. And yet still it's polluted, and we have a fishery where the fish are dying before they can be fished. So having resources and technology and insight isn't necessarily the best approach. So I think your question is, what's transferable? I think some of the principles are transferable, but they also need to be scalable. And they also need to be aware of the resource implications. And you need to adjust that and deal with that. I think we have the luxury of lots of resources compared to other regions. I, of course, when I meet my countries and I meet the people who pay for our advice, will say it's still not enough because we can do better and we want to do better. But it may not, the actual incredibly engineered solution that is often the ICES solution may not be appropriate in other parts of the world. I quite honestly say that. And the one thing I don't want to say is look at ICES, we're the solution, because we're not. And we're on the journey in our context as much as everybody else is on a journey. Does that help?
Yeah, it's quite helpful. It gives a perspective that demystifies, or you don't need to have ICES as the gold standard.
No,
it's just a player in the game with some good solutions that apply to the areas where ICES operates.
I think that's a wonderful summary of what I just waffled. Yes, thank you.
I think actually the kind of oversight that you provided today, Mark, that is the kind of exportable good in many ways out of ICES, because there's a century of refinement behind it, and rather than trying to repeat that century of refinement somewhere else, there's benefits to be drawn from a long and yes, well-resourced and complex process that can then hopefully be adapted and potentially in a much more lightweight situation in other contexts as well, by drawing on that experience.
I think there's one property of ICES, or two properties of ICES, which I think are exportable. And social scientists and experts in policy, evidence for policy, regularly bring this up. The first one is, they use the phrase polycentric. It's a terrible phrase, but it means that we have lots of different things going on all over the place, and people are all feeding into the system. And I think that is a very useful characteristic. And anybody who tries to control the network of ICES is going to fail, because to start with, no one understands the entire network of ICES. Now, that is an anathema to best practice or quality assurance, because there you have to document everything, you should be aware of where things are. But in fact, that's impossible in ICES. In terms of data flows, it works. In terms of advice, it works. But in terms of the science network, that doesn't work at all. The second property that I think is exportable and crucial, and Jens just touched on it, is it's reflective. ICES is obsessed with ICES. Now that is terribly myopic, it's terribly inward looking, and we love reorganizing and doing things like that. But actually the periodic self-reflection means that we constantly challenge ourselves, and social scientists who have studied us have said that's a strength of ICES, in that we never actually say, well, this is it and this is how it should be and we are best practice, because we're not. But how do we move forward? How do we make things better? How do we kind of keep our role going? And I think it might be our unique position as not being linked or part of an RFMO. We have no automatic legitimacy. Our trust in ICES has to be earned. We're not written by, well, we are written into the NEAF system, but we're not written into the actually it's a lie. This year they're beginning to write us into the system in the EU as well. And we're being written in, I think, into the Fisheries Act of the UK. So, but overall, we have a role where we have to show that we are legitimate and independent. So it's that reflection, and also the polycentric nature. But we are unique in the world. That's the other thing. No one else. we were written, FAO did a study of all the advisors to the RFMOs, and ICES was absent. And that's because we don't come under FAO. We're independent of FAO. I have a question for Peter. You touched on, and for the rest of you as well, actually. I was sent a document by Cisco on the Baltic, and it was about 10 years old. And this group seems to have picked up the 3 areas from that document. And the third area was compliance, enforcement. Now, RFMOs have to work in that field. ICES doesn't. How do you see that in this context?
Good question. I'll allow others to comment on that as well. I think the true answer is we're not sure. We thought it's worth bringing up and see what people think about it. I do recognize that it's quite different than the others in terms of the role of scientific experience, knowledge, how to bring that into the picture. It may be an issue, some areas like illegal fishing. How do we deal with that in also the other part of producing the management advice? It's basically listed here as an invitation to the community to discuss what they think are important and whether we have anything to contribute in that area as well. I don't think I've made very deep thoughts on that particular issue beyond it, and I understand your question, why you bring it up, because we haven't really talked about it, and it wasn't probably natural for you to talk about it in your intro. Are there best practices out there in this field that we should be aware of? Then I think it's well worth that we explore this. And if we haven't done it yet, we still have a gathering tomorrow, and if we're not able to pick it up, then should something be done about this in the future? Anybody else? Yeah.
I mean, the only thing I can say is I work in a directorate in government that has both scientists and enforcers, so to speak. So we have 2 divisions. We have a science division, and we have what we call a compliance division that consists of fisheries inspectors and enforcement vessels, and then we have research vessels. So they do operate in separate capacities, and I think that's an important distinction. That was something that when this directorate was formed from former agencies in Scotland became quite an important discussion and distinction in terms of how both sides actually continue to engage with the stakeholders in the industry in general. Obviously, in order to be able to monitor part of commercial activities, the science division sends observers onto vessels, and there needed to be a consideration about the fact that suddenly you're now in the same organization that enforces all infractions. So does that now mean that the observer on board a vessel is operating in that capacity as well? And that was actually written directly into some of our guidance and remit for observers. You're not expected to fulfill those functions, for example. I'm not saying whether that's right or wrong, but I think it's a very, very important thing to consider for actually part of the social aspect as well of your stakeholder engagement and trying how you build trust with the people that you work closely with, but also do have to, in this instance, for example, monitor for legal compliance. Likewise, in terms of how we operate the vessels, the research vessel will only operate as a research vessel in that capacity. There'll never be a boarding of a fisheries vessel for an infraction from our research vessel, for example. And those are some of the standards that's been developed. To be brutally honest, quite reactive and probably only thought of after the two organizations were joined together, but they were established fairly quickly. And I think, we've now been there for a little over a decade. And I think that side of things is maturing reasonably well in striking a balance there. Obviously, there can be challenges in that area in terms of, everybody that works in the organization is a civil servant and expected to, adhere to the law and be representative of the aims and objectives of the government as a whole. But there are some principles laid out that has been agreed also on the policy level, at least. I don't know if that's the experience in other organizations. I think most other places tend to have a stronger segregation between the two that perhaps makes it in some ways a clearer issue to maintain best practices separate in the two areas. And maybe the question is sometimes whether they're too separate as well.
Yeah, just to add to that, in the Norwegian case, we have a clear separation between the Institute of Marine Research giving the kind of advice we've been talking about and the Directorate of Fisheries in having responsibility for compliance. Both organizations are responding to the ministry, so government, we're all government employees, but we have a quite distinct and different roles. So there is not a lot of connections between the a lot of contacts and connections between the directorate and the institute, but not in terms of bridging these two tasks. They are quite separate. So that's our experience, and maybe that's why I at least don't have very much to bring to the table in terms of this compliance part. We do have a lot of interaction with the industry, and we are using commercial vessels for some of our research activities. So there's not only, and these players of course also have to respond to the directorate's various activities and so on. Yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
I also don't have much to bring on the table about this, but I would think, or in my mind, enforcement is more a political decision, a political issue, than actual of compliance or implementation. And I'm saying that because you can have the best practice, the best practices in actually trying to enforce decisions, scientific advice, management advice. But at the end of the day, somebody has to take, has to want to implement this advice. It's totally different in areas like Europe, Norway, the US, or other places in the world where there is a will for enforcement, compared to areas where you can send an observer on board and he will end up missing and then will end up dead, because these things happen in other areas of the world. So at the end of the day, the practice was there. Probably it was the best practice to send an observer and do his job or reply back. But when these incidents occur, it means that there is a lack of political will to protect this process. So it's not always easy to, for me at least, to distinguish the political character of the enforcement and the will that has to be there in order for this to take place.
I think that you've actually touched on something really important there, that we might be quite familiar with the separation between compliance and science remits within an industry. But the question is whether the stakeholders are as well. And I don't know if that's always the, I think on a general level, there's a degree of awareness, but there will always be the tendency to say, well, it's them, it's all those people that regulate our business or our livelihood or something like that. So, and so I think there's a need to have clarity and stuff. And I think in particular in situations that you mentioned there, you know, the horrible histories about international observers that have gone missing without very much protection or support, which is quite concerning in many ways. I don't know if anybody aware. I recall reading an article about it, that there is an organization that's trying to develop some kind of framework or set of best guidance for this, but I can't remember who it is. I'll try and see if I can find it again, but it might not be within the time frame of this chat today.
But maybe we could get it before the session is over, or the whole week is over. That would be good. No, I think maybe one reason for having this included is, of course, we have, I guess many have experience of management advice and management plans and so forth being developed and looking nice on paper, but if there's no compliance, then it's kind of not very inspiring to deal with these things, and that's in some areas where I guess, Nikos, you have been and others have been, that certainly happens. There's so much illegal fishing going on and so much happening that, you know, the whole point of producing advice maybe is lost. And if there is something we can sort of evolve as a best practice of that kind of linkage, it would be interesting. And I don't know exactly what it would be, but a reason for keeping it in.
As I said, there are political issues that enter in my mind at least, that enter the field of enforcement or compliance. So at the end of the day, when you have IUU issues, when you have major players like China wanting to acquire license to fish anywhere in Africa, there will be a political game in the background that whatever the advice you provide, it might not be heard or it might not be enforced because of other reasons. It's not that far apart from the TAC system that we have in Europe and the negotiations about TACs, but it is on another level, I believe.
Okay, we have another couple of participants who have joined, maybe not for the full session, but who are here. We are approaching the end of the session, and we don't have to stay on until 10:30. We can stop when we feel that we've explored the issue we want to explore. But are there anybody who hasn't taken the floor, or even who has taken the floor, who would like to speak before we draw to a close? Yes, Christian.
Just because, well, I really appreciate the honesty from Mark on saying, well, ICES, yes, we work to improve, but we don't claim being best practices because we are not, but we are still obsessed on improving ourselves, and I guess that's a very good point. But probably I would wonder, Mark, would you kind of identify any champion in this topic of management and advice? Any kind of use case or any kind of example that you would point as a well, clearly as an example or as a success story to follow up in terms of further development of best practices in relation, again, with management and advice?
If someone claims to be perfect, then they're not. Okay, I think that's a clear thing, and I think what I didn't touch on, but I think Ava is going to touch on in a bigger way. I mean, I kind of alluded to it. Everything is context specific, and our kind of approach is it works for large industrial fisheries, but it certainly wouldn't work with community-based fisheries or individuals or leisure fisheries even. It's a little more tricky. So everything I think is context-based. There are a number of experts in this field. I mean, World Fish have done a lot of work, FAO have done a lot of work, CSIRO have done a lot of work. I mean, there's tons out there. As you know, in my network, I've got NOAA and DFO, and it just varies all over the place. What happens in the Azores is extremely different from what happens in the Barents Sea. So I don't think there is such a thing as perfect. I think striving to be perfect is appropriate, fine. But the one thing I'm always wary of is if things are made concrete, if they're made rigid. I think there has to be a flexibility. There has to be an evaluation and a reform cycle put into any system that you set up, because situations always change. I mean, look what's happened this year. Whoever could have predicted that, you know? So that's where we are. I'm sorry, I didn't answer your question, Christian.
No, but this last comment is very interesting, because 2 hours ago we were in a convergence of methods sessions, and this was one of the main issues that was shown about this constant review and improvement of the things, because the world is, yeah, in that sense, it's not linear, it's not static, so things are evolving, and we need to allocate resources and to go through that direction. Maybe I will reformulate the question. Would you identify, because now that we were talking about the compliance, would you identify, or you guys, this question might be also asked to the rest of the people here, would you probably identify any use case or good example of this management advice being provided and a good transition to the compliance with this management advice provided?
There's a lot of work on that. And generally, if you co-create, if you share how you've come up with that advice, if people understand, and a lot of that is in the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, then you're more likely to get compliance and reduced enforcement issues. If you impose, then you'll have problems. And if there's no understanding for the underlying rationale for why you're imposing, you're going to have even more problems. Common fisheries policy in the 1970s is a beautiful example of a failed approach. And now they became path dependent, as it's called, but they're now having to leave that path and find another way of dealing with it. Because, yeah, enforcement by regulation and imposition is never going to succeed in fisheries. Yeah. Touching on another issue, this idea that having cameras on all the ships is going to be a panacea is actually quite interesting, because, sorry, how on earth are you going to enforce cameras on ships monitoring everybody unless you have AI, and we haven't got the resources for that at the moment. So it's all, yeah. You've got to work with the people who want the objectives, and you've got to work with the people who are affected by the objectives. That's my take.
Hi, I'm just joining the session. I hope it's okay to make a comment. My name's Ian Salter. I'm from the Faroese Marine Research Institute. So I'm not working directly in fisheries. I'm actually working with environmental DNA, but using it to explore the idea of alternative approaches for stock assessment. So that's why I'm kind of moving between the sessions. So I was just listening and learning a lot about what you were talking about. I understand one of the problems is developing best practices for stock assessment, but there's this secondary problem then of how do you achieve compliance with industry. And this may be a naive comment, but one idea I've had in the past is that if you can make it attractive for stakeholders to comply, so I've seen a lot of talks from psychologists and social scientists that reward is a much more effective way of soliciting certain types of behavior than punishment is. So, you know, if, for example, you could create some kind of labelization for fish that adhere to these standards in the sense that then the stakeholders might get a higher price per kilo, for example, is that anything that's been explored as a way to try to encourage individual stakeholders to comply more? But, you know, we're not telling you to do this, but there are consumers in the market who are mindful to these sustainable fishing practices and are willing to pay a higher price per kilo if they know that it's coming from a sustainable practice. And yeah, that was my comment.
Yeah, Ian, we were talking about fisheries advice, not necessarily the stock assessments. And
Okay.
I would put the question back to you. I don't like the word comply. Rather than saying an individual has to comply, would it be more constructive to persuade that individual that this process is their process?
Yeah, maybe, yeah. I used the word compliance because I heard it.
Yeah,
but,
no, we were talking about it, yeah.
Yeah.
But if you have complete buy-in into a process, you'll never have complete buy-in. But if you have a sense of ownership of the process and a stake in the process, rather than just the outcome of the process, it might be a different arena.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there was an example of a group I was working in with Ireland for a recent EU proposal, but it was kind of related about marine litter and how we can engage stakeholders being the fishing community to help with that. So there was this kind of trawling for litter program when all of the plastic that comes up in the trawls is logged. And, you know, the way that they had engaged the stakeholders is if the fishing vessels, you know, recorded those catches of plastic, then they got some sustainable kind of code and they could get a higher price per kilo of fish because people were mindful that they were contributing to some kind of environmental problem. So it was a lot of extra work for them, and unless they had this reward or this buy-in to the process, there's of course no motivation for them to spend time doing that and wasting valuable fishing time. But if they could receive a better price for their product because they were seen to adhere to a certain set of practices, then they were willing to do that. And I wonder if similar kinds of psychological kind of approaches about buying into this whole process and actually benefiting from it directly for companies or for fishing, for different boat owners and things would actually help to move some of these advice into practice. But as I say, it's probably a very naive comment because I'm not working in this area, but it's just something I've often thought about. Yeah.
And luckily, I don't have to think about it because it's fisheries management rather than fisheries management advice.
I mean, because there are some trials and experimental transparency programs going on, not all within fishing, like there's farm to fork type transparency, food traceability elements going on. Also in the context of climate change, that increasingly consumers want to know and understand the origin and the production associated with their food. And obviously there has been some traceability experiments at least within Europe that I'm aware of at least sort of port to plate almost type context as well. And I wonder, that might be something actually in terms of a bridging over between, you know, the compliance and the stakeholder buy-in and a degree of consumer transparency that we might see development in, and that would need an element of best practice as well. Whether we're the right people for that, I don't know, but something is happening in that area at least.
Thank you. I was also going to say in aquaculture, there are sustainability initiatives which are quite well advanced, and consumer preferences are then driving this. We are actually have to close now. There is other things happening, and we've taken up 90 minutes of your time. I think we just want to at this point thank everybody. I think we had a good discussion in the small group, high quality discussion, not the quantitative numbers of people that matter, it's the quality of what we do. And I want to thank you all, but Mark in particular for that. I take with me a lot from this session, and I won't try to summarize it. We talked about polycentric activities within the scientific and management advice, and I think that probably also will persist in the policy and management arena beyond what we have been talking about, and probably as not striving towards a single solution to everything, being flexible, many good principles that can be transferred, whereas not specific things should be transferred all around the world. Yeah, we have to close. We filled the hour and a half, and thank you all, Mark in particular. Unless you have a burning 10-second message to us at the end, Mark, I want to just end and say thank you to all. Okay, and thank you all, and perhaps see you in a later session tomorrow or whatever, depending on your schedule. We will certainly follow up and report. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a nice day.